Okay, welcome everybody to our session on what can a mentorship do for you. My name is Duncan Large and I'm the Academic Director of the British Centre for Literary Translation. Our session is sponsored by the National Centre for Writing, who run the Emerging Translators Mentoring Scheme in the UK. Next year is going to be the 10th anniversary of the scheme. So we thought it would be a good moment to think about the UK Emerging Translators Scheme, to reflect back over its successes in its first 9-10 years, to think about the impact that it's had in various ways on translators, on publishers and beyond, and to think about the place that the Emerging Translators Scheme in the UK now holds in the international perspective. Because the scheme in the UK has been imitated by a number of other schemes which are now in place elsewhere. So to discuss these matters, we have a panel of 4 speakers. I feel a bit like Nicholas Parsons introducing Just a Minute and saying, I have 4 exciting and talented players of the game who are going to be speaking on a topic. I don't know whether it will be without hesitation. I won't continue with that metaphor, but we're going to be talking about a number of questions then relating to these issues. Firstly, what makes for a successful mentorship, and potentially what are the pitfalls? We'll come on to talk about the question of impact, about the effect and in many ways transformative effect that a mentorship has had on the successful mentee and on the mentors. And then we'll be thinking latterly about what more might be done, what's needed now. I fully expect that we'll have time at the end to open up to discussion from our audience. So let me start off by introducing our speakers. To my right then is somebody about whom, of course, there is really no need.
Nothing to be said.
There's no need for an introduction, but of course I will nonetheless introduce Daniel Hahn, who is a prolific and multi-award-winning writer, editor, and translator, former chair of the Society of Authors, the UK's Writers' Union, known in recent times perhaps especially for his generosity in founding and setting up the Translators Association First Translation Prize in 2017. But Danny is on our panel today because of another thing that he set up back in 2010, which was precisely the UK Emerging Translators Mentorship Scheme. So Danny had an important role in setting up the scheme and is now one of the mentors, and is also involved in the Escalator scheme for talent development of fiction writers, which is also organised by the National Centre for Writing. So that will be an interesting, I think, parallel perspective that Danny will be able to bring. The mentorship scheme in the UK was founded by Danny in 2010 when Danny was based at the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia, initially as a pilot project with just a couple of languages, French and Chinese, but then from 2011 with a dozen languages, and it's been at around that level ever since. There have been in total so far 81 emerging translators over the years and 31 languages represented. Since 2012, the scheme has partnered with Havelseka Young Translators Prize, and in 2015, the administration of the scheme passed from BCLT to the National Centre for Writing in Norwich, and it's currently administered by Sarah Bauer there. This year, there are 8 mentees who are supported by the scheme. And I know a number of them are in the audience today, and very nice to see you. The aim of the scheme then, as in its current form, is to match up experienced translators with emerging translators for a period of 6 months. And then over that period, for at least 4 meetings, whether in person or remotely, the mentors and mentees work on a project together, but the idea is also to provide practical advice and for the mentor to be an advocate for the emerging translators, particularly with publishers. So mentors and mentees receive a fee, and the scheme, though, as it currently exists, is about rather more than simply working on a project. It culminates in an industry day in Norwich, and mentees are invited to the London Book Fair every year. So there's a quite well-established scheme then in the UK, and we have also, on my far right, we have Mikael Johanni, who is one of the winners of the 2018-19 Emerging Translators Mentorship Program here in the UK. So Mikael is representing the mentees' perspective. Mikael is a poet, a critic and translator from Jakarta, Indonesia. His first poetry book, We Are Nowhere and It's Wow, was published by Postpress in 2017, and he's now working on Mongrels, his second poetry collection. He's also working on a translation of Rompas's poetry collection, Non-Specific, and already one of the poems from that collection, his English version of One by One the Bodies Died, won an honourable mention in last year's Hawker Prize for Southeast Asian Poetry. So Mikael will be representing the mentees' perspective. We have also Julia Gulbinovic, who is representing the perspective of a different scheme, the Lithuanian Translator Fellowship. Julia is a translator who studied in Lithuania, studied philology and Croatian language at Vilnius University, but then came to the UK for a master's degree at Queen Mary University of London. And she's continued to come to the UK frequently. She's participated in our BCLT summer school in Norwich for a couple of summers, the last couple of iterations in 2017 and 18. Julia translated works from Croatian and Serbian into Lithuanian, and her first translation into English was a play by the Lithuanian playwright Labanauskaitė for the project Poetry House Live, and that was performed in 2016. So Julia will be talking about the Lithuanian Literary Translation Fellowship, which is initiated by the British Council and the Lithuanian Culture Institute. So as a point of comparison to the UK scheme. And then our final speaker, Jeremy Tiang, is a distinguished author and translator who was appointed the inaugural literary translator of this London Book Fair. And Jeremy has a wealth of experience, both mentoring for the UK scheme this year, and he's mentoring Hindi and Punjabi. But he's also been involved with a number of other international schemes in Singapore, in the United States, and the Yiddish mentoring scheme as well, most recently, I heard just now. So Jeremy has translated novels and non-fiction from the Chinese, but he also writes and translates plays, including for the Royal Court and the Manchester Royal Exchange, and is the recipient of a Pen Hein grant, the People's Literature Prize Mao Tai Cup for translation, and an NEA Literary Translation Fellowship. So, those are our speakers, those are our perspectives. We have a session which runs until 1 o'clock in principle. As I say, I'd like to open up, until 2 o'clock. It runs for an hour. And I'd like to open up to the audience latterly. But I'd like to start off by asking each of our speakers in turn to say something from their perspective about simply what makes for a good mentorship from their varying perspectives, both of the UK scheme and of other schemes. What makes for a good mentorship? Potentially then, what are the pitfalls? and perhaps I can ask Danny to kick off.
Hello, good afternoon. It's an interesting question, and one of the things that I've seen over the course of our translation mentorship over the last 8 or 9 years, and also my involvement with Escalator, is that the successful mentorships all seem to be successful in different ways. And possibly that then is the answer to the question, that there is a certain amount of flexibility to what is available to the mentee that is kind of built into the program. One of the things that we always talked about, Sarah and I, when we were kind of developing the actual program of what the mentees would do over the course of the translation mentorship, was figuring out how to give the mentor-mentee pairs enough guidance, but not too much guidance. Enough guidance so it felt like they had a sense of scale, so they had a sense of expectation, that sort of thing, but also they could create a sort of program for themselves which would meet the needs of the mentee. Everyone who is at whatever point in their career as a translator or as a writer needs slightly different things, and the schemes that seem to me to work well are the ones that allow for that. That's not to say that there are no rules, no constraints, no expectations, but there is a certain amount of flexibility built in, which allows for, first of all, the mentee to be able to benefit in ways that suit them really specifically at this particular juncture in their career, with this particular experience, this particular desire to develop, but also which suits the mentor, and so the mentor feels like they can actually be helpful in a particular way. One of the things that's always been really important is the mentor being involved in the selection of the mentee, because often we would have a mentor who'd look at some applications and go, well, this person is obviously great, but I'm not sure I would be the right person to help them. What they need is help with this, which is not the thing that I'm most confident in or strongest at. And so that sort of flexibility to develop a partnership where it's quite clear what the mentee needs and what the mentor can provide, but it's built in a very specific way. It's built to suit that really particular pair, I think. That's incredibly important.
Thank you, Danny. Can I ask Mikael next, from your perspective of the mentee?
Okay, I think my experience with the NCW mentorship program has been very interesting. Like, I learned a lot about the industry. You know, I know now how to deliver my 2-minute elevator pitch. I've got my takeaways and comms ready. I know the reality of the translation book industry more now. I know that I translate poetry, and now I know that poetry doesn't sell. So, so that's all great. But I think maybe one of the pitfalls of the program, I think it's sort of maybe specific to this situation in my country in terms of translation, because translation of Indonesian literature for many years has been dominated by Indonesianists who are not necessarily professional translators or writers. And apart from being academics who write about Indonesia and also translate Indonesian literature, they also act as sort of gatekeepers to our literature. And the funny thing is that, like, say 2 of the biggest books that have done well on the international book market, Eka Kurniawan's Beauty is a Wound and Man Tiger, they weren't actually translated by these Indonesianists. One is translated by Annie Tucker, an American translator, and the other one, the first book of Eka Kurniawan that got translated and published in the UK, was actually, people kind of forget about this, but it was actually translated by an Indonesian, Labodali Sembiring. And the thing is that, like, apart from him, a lot of these mostly white gatekeepers of Indonesian literature, they're working excluding bilingual heritage speaker L2 non-white translators like me in Indonesia. And the reality is there's a lot of people like me. We translate each other. We do 2-way translation from English into Indonesian and Indonesian into English. But I was actually quite surprised that I got accepted to the mentorship program because I applied for it because I thought maybe if I got accepted, then other kids like me would realize that there are all these fundings and stuff that are available, and we can actually get it because like usually the people who get the deals are like we call it native speakers, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so there is another problem is that like when I went to Norwich, I was quite surprised that like the writing what the Writing Center knows about Indonesian literature is sort of almost exclusively funneled through the Lontara Foundation, which is headed by an white American man who has been working as maybe the ultimate gatekeeper of Indonesian literature for like 30 years. And at the moment, actually, in my country, there has been a lot of protests and a lot of criticism to the way Lontara Foundation represents our literature to the world, including to the book fair. Like which writers that get exposed, which translators get, like promoted and things like that. So it's a complex picture, and so like my mentor and me as well, we sort of like get stuck in this sort of political power play, and actually like my mentor, she's Australian, very nice lady. She wrote an essay for National Center for Writing last year, and the essay was republished a week before the London Book Fair. And at first, unfortunately, it sort of like all the younger writers in my country got really up in arms about it because the article was not mentioning all these other names that people think should be mentioned. But then again, I think inadvertently that article actually started a conversation that I think needed to happen, for many years. So yeah, actually that was a good thing. Yeah. So yeah, maybe I'll say a few things more, but that's it for the time being.
Thank you. I think what you've just been talking about brings out one of the kind of key elements of this scheme in the UK, which is its experimental nature in a lot of ways, and the range of languages, as I mentioned, it's over 30 languages by now, which have been covered over the last 9 years, means that the scheme is aiming to broaden the exposure of the reading public to different literatures, to bring on new translators in all kinds of ways, perhaps translators who are just emerging from academic study, but perhaps from geographical areas and which one would not otherwise expect. I wonder whether perhaps I can bring in Julia at this point to talk about the Lithuanian Literary Translator Fellowship, which is it shares some features, of course, but there's some important differences as well. This is a scheme which is restricted to one language, and is relatively recent. I wonder if you could perhaps say a little about your experience.
Yes. I think maybe to connect it to what Michal has just said about being a bilingual translator, in our case, we were four who held the fellowship, the Literary Translation Fellowship last year, sponsored and initiated by the Lithuanian Culture Institute and the British Council. And the two of us were native English speakers, and the two boys and two girls, myself and a friend of mine, she became a friend, were Lithuanian native speakers. So that was a very, I think that's what set it apart for us, I think, maybe from other programs, because very quickly we realized that we are screwed, or something like that, because we have it's very difficult to be trying to do something like that when you're not a native speaker. But then that was, while being a difficulty, also became a very important feature of that fellowship, and a lot of focus was placed on that, on empowering people who have, and both of us, Agne and I, have been living in the UK for a very long time. And so, where perhaps those sort of middle ground people, no longer in Lithuania, but forever outside in the UK. So enabling people like us to try and come out from the underground, maybe some sort of a translating underground, which we both have ventured into in one way or another, but didn't know what to do with it. But then it was a very lucky marriage, if you wish, of I think the point in which we both felt we were, and the initiative which recognized the need for the development of translators who would work from Lithuanian into English. And so in many senses it was a very lucky kind of coincidence. And then of course the summer school, I'm not entirely sure. Of course it was. It wasn't a coincidence, right, that the summer school suddenly was available in Lithuanian as well, right? And we were able to participate in the summer school twice, which was an absolute luxury and an amazing opportunity. So that was a very interesting experience. And then another point as well, which I picked up from Michalis, is that it's a very complex picture. So what I'm grateful for mainly, grateful for, is that it allowed us to, from that underground, to enter into that complex picture and see it and be frightened of it, and maybe then later maybe a bit less frightened, and then on another occasion very frightened again, and so to venture into this big and complex world where you are not entirely sure what's going on and what can be done with it. And another point which maybe I thought remained not underexplored, in my opinion, completely maybe unexplored, is how does a non-native speaker work into the language that is not their own. I felt at many panels which I attended and talks and so on and events, it was never discussed. At least I did not hear it. Maybe I missed some crucial things, but so that's for me.
Thank you, Julia. So we've been hearing about your surprise that the schemes support translators working into a non-native language. And I wonder, turning to Jeremy, if I could ask also from the perspective of the mentor, how it feels to be working with, in your case, a language such as Hindi, which you are not otherwise a native speaker of, and you have then experience of working with Indian languages this year for the NCW Emerging Translators Program scheme here in the UK, but you've also a wealth of experience on other programs as well, and I wonder if you could say something about those programs too.
Sure. I suppose the first thing to say is that having grown up in a former British colony, I don't know that I have a native language, or at least I have complicated relationships with my many possibly native languages. So I think I come to this with the initial impulse to complicate the situation. And I want to echo Danny's point that flexibility is key with all of these programs. So while I've served as a mentor on various schemes, what they've all had in common is that they've given a lot of space for the mentor and mentee to decide what type of relationship, working relationship, would best benefit them. And for the mentor, it's about providing enough structure that feels like some kind of direction, because you can't just say to someone who's coming into the industry new, what do you need? You don't know what you need, but you also can't be overly prescriptive and say these are the steps that we will take. So it's giving enough signposts, and particularly I have discovered hard deadlines for the mentees, but also listening to them when they say, I want to do this, or I want to find out more about this. And there's a whole range of possibilities. Usually the starting point is that people know that they want to translate. They're drawn to it, they enjoy it, they feel it's important work. But then you say, well, do you want to do it full-time as a freelancer? Do you want to do it on the side? Do you want to do it as part of your academic practice or your writing practice? And people often either haven't thought about these things or just simply can't answer these questions yet. So you're also guiding them towards an awareness of what context they're translating within. It's not, this abstract thing where you go off to an ivory tower and you translate. You're doing it within everything else you're doing, and how does that fit together? Because I translate full-time, I think it can be reassuring when I say to people, yes, I am able to support myself by translating novels, so it can be done, but also you don't have to. And it's quite freeing to say you can do this or you can do it some other way. There is no one way to be a translator. I think within the mentorships, it's about the context that they're set up in. So what really differs is the time frame and who gets paid and how much, which is really important. Ideally, the mentee should be paid as well. And I have done ones where they pay to be mentored, which I'm less comfortable with. Because it should be an environment where you're supported, I think, and guided into the profession. It should feel welcoming. With this current one that I'm doing for Norwich, it was, I suppose, endowed is the right word, by Deborah Smith, the visionary editor and translator of Tilted Axis. And it's specifically for a translator of color, a non-white translator, which has contextualized the mentorship differently in that the conversations I find myself having with my mentee have often been along the lines of, here are the things white editors will say to you, and here is how you can argue back when they suggest there is such a thing as standard English, because there is not. And we should feel free to translate into other Englishes. So the things that we've talked about have differed. And then also, my previous mentorships were with Chinese translators, but I speak neither Hindi nor Punjabi. And I've recently embarked on another mentorship for the Yiddish Book Centre, who incidentally were recently shortlisted for a London Book Fair Award. Congratulations. And again, I don't speak Yiddish, so that's a whole different adventure. I know, I could learn. But what I think this has shown is that there are some aspects of translation that are universal and that apply across the languages. And it's been interesting to me to see, when I float certain things, if they resonate with the mentee or actually, no, that's just a Chinese thing. But to my pleasant surprise, most things have resonated and most things have been true of all literary translation, not just of a particular language. So...
Can I ask Jeremy a question? Whether you feel that there are benefits to not knowing. And I ask this partly because I've done 2 mentorships with translators with languages I don't speak, but also, in fact, with Yulia's program, I came in and did a workshop with the 4 translators on the Lithuanian Fellowship, and I know as much Lithuanian as you know Hindi. And in some ways it feels quite useful not being distracted by the particularities of people's issues with a specific language, and actually you get to quite different questions. And I wonder whether actually you've benefited from I mean, my ignorance is vast and incredibly helpful sometimes.
I think it's true in that if you, because the Chinese translators are so embattled and there are so few of us, it can get a bit insider baseball. So it's quite freeing to go out into the wider world of other languages and also to feel like we're working as translators and not just as Chinese translators within the context of the community as a whole. And yeah, you don't get bogged down into the minutiae of linguistics.
Mm-hmm. So mentorship is, as we've already heard, about many things. Yes, there's a product at the end of it, and I must wave the brochure, which is fairly hot off the press actually, just a week or two ago, which includes extracts from the projects on which this year's emerging translators on the Norwich scheme have been working, and there are extracts from Mikael and from the other mentees on this year's scheme, and I know there were, at least earlier, were still some at the back, but it's also available as an e-publication on the National Centre for Writing website. So it's about producing a product, yes, but we've also started to hear about all the other things that mentorships can do, about the element of forming a translator, about passing on tips, about the practicalities. And I wonder if I can invite, we've heard from everybody now, I'm not going to keep going down the line, I wonder if we can kind of free things up a bit and ask for your thoughts on that side of the mentorship programs, whichever, whether in the UK or abroad, and how important that aspect is from your perspective. I don't know.
I think just briefly, one of the things that you get from most of these programs is something which Julia touched on, which is also being part of a community, which is also how you continue to learn. There are a lot of people who are on our first, second, third mentoring scheme back in 2010, 11, 12, who still are good friends and who are in touch and who help each other out. And I always feel like a proud parent or grandparent or something when I see on Facebook pictures of people who've gone on holiday together, and I think they met each other, they're one of ours. But I think one of the things you get is not just the experience of having a mentor who can help in whichever ways you happen to need, but it's also being part of a sort of tribe, part of a gang of people who are more or less at the same stage in their career, who will be dealing with some of the same questions in some cases, who will be able to share tips. I mean, one of the things that I love about the NCW program is they all come together. There's a moment, in this case there was a weekend, when a lot of the mentees came and spent 2 days in Norwich and not only worked with the mentors and with other people, but they also spent some time getting to know each other. And I think that's a really important and valuable thing when you're near the beginning of a career, particularly but not exclusively if you're not based in London or New York, where a lot of the acquiring of the books has to happen at the moment. And so finding yourself part of the community where you then come to the Literary Translation Centre, the London Book Fair, and you know a few people already, and you come to the first International Translation Day in October, and you know a few people already. I think it's so important that the translation profession in the English-speaking world is so dependent on this community in ways that I think are mostly very good. But the mentorship is partly about kind of welcoming a group of people who are going to add different things to this weird gang of people, many of whom are sitting before you. I'm trying not to catch anybody's. Actually, I will catch some eyes.
Maybe I can pick up on your point. Maybe I can tell a little bit of a story how my mentor and I tried to solve the problems that we had because of all the literary politics that got involved in our mentorship sort of like process. I mean, the problem with like having Indonesianists translating Indonesian literature is I once worked as an editor for a translation of a collection of short stories by an Indonesian author translated by an American Indonesianist from Cornell. And the problem was that like this guy tried to have like half a page footnote every few pages, and because he wanted to like show off his research, and so I was trying to like maybe don't do that too often, but but obviously he wasn't listening. But the problem is mostly because like this Indonesian is sort of kind of like work. They work in Cornell, they work in Sydney Uni, they work in everywhere, and the translating works like the one that I'm doing right now. For us, the poetry that I'm translating, and I'm also a poet, it's more of a life experience. It's something real. It's not an academic sort of kind of like exercise, and so. What I tried to do was to invite my mentor to Jakarta to see the poetry scene there. I run a poetry open mic night in Jakarta, so I took her there to listen to the readings. I took her to see a lecture performance by a young poet. I took her to see all this, like the bookshops there, so she could see the scene and she could see how the poetry of the author that I'm working on grew out of. And so actually that worked really well because she's very open-minded. So before that she sort of like didn't really understand my translation strategy, but then after we spent about a week in Jakarta, she finally understood it. But that's the thing, you have to see, especially as like, since we're not in New York or London, the translators or the mentors, the white mentors or the white translators, they have to come, I think, to Indonesia and see what it's like, for certain works,
And, I would like to also second Danny speaking about the community and how important of a formative thing it is. And I need to mention my mentor, and it's this girl who is a poet and a translator, and she's probably blushing somewhere in the audience. It's Jen Kalea. Of whom I knew nothing before, and then I learned a lot. It was a very, it was simply nice to hang out to start with, and secondly, she introduced me to people like the Society of Authors and the awards that they hold every year, of which I knew nothing. And that made quite an impression on me. It's interesting, and for example, this year I followed them because now I know who they are, and with whom also we didn't have such a formal relationship. In fact, I believe we become something as friends, and then we could gossip about the people we know from the circles, and who is hot and who is less so, and so on. And anyway, and then another point which is important, I can't thank the Lithuanian Culture Institute enough, because they have been also as a sort of a cluster of mentors for me, because I don't know, they just come across as a very dynamic, and they are, I believe, a very dynamic place. They're not people who talk much, maybe. They're people who do, and that's great. That's what you need in mentorships like that, such specific things. And what they did mainly for me was kind of pushed us to the front of things, and said, recommended us to various projects, such as, I don't know, being a bridge translator at the translating workshop between two British poets, one of whom was Francis Lewinston, and two Lithuanian ones, and so on and so forth. And also gave us work, translation work, not necessarily literature, but a chance to practice. So yeah, that was very.
Can I just say very quickly, you mentioned your mentor, Jane Kalea, who is in the audience, and who, as of 1 minute past midnight last night, is on the long list for the International Booker, by the way. So if she wasn't blushing when you said that, I'm going to take another crack at it.
Please, yes.
So I think that's a really good distinction, that the mentorships aren't about just learning to translate, but learning to be a translator. And it's a certain way of existing and reading and writing, and a whole practice, not just a craft. So while I never participated formally in a mentorship when I was coming into the industry, I feel that I was mentored just by spending time with more established translators who were incredibly generous with their time and advice and contacts. And so I learned a lot about how to be a translator just by observing the role models around me. Mentorships are really great in that they formalize these relationships and also make sure that people get paid to do what they do, to advise. But equally, there are plenty of opportunities even outside of this for emerging translators to just spend time with their more established colleagues and to be mentored in that way, almost by osmosis.
Thank you. Yes, thinking about the establishment of a community, that begins already with the announcement of the winners, doesn't it? As far as the NCW scheme is concerned, last year it was part of the International Translation Day event at the end of September, and I know the aim is to try and get together as many of the winners as possible for that event. Before we go any further, I should say that the NCW scheme is aiming to announce winners again at roughly the same time this year. And for that to happen, there needs to be a competition, and that will be announced. The plan is towards the end of July this year. So do watch out for that. So end of July, the announcement of the competition, and the winners announced in the autumn. Thinking about the impact that the UK scheme has had over the years, it's had some notable successes with successful mentees then going on to publish their work and receiving prestigious prizes for it. I'm thinking of Ruth Ahmedzai Kemp's translation of Ulrich Rauff's Farewell to the Horse, which was Sunday Times History Book of the Year in 2017, and then subsequently Radio 4 Book of the Week in 2018. Sean Bai's translation of History of a Disappearance by Philip Springer won the Asymptote Close Approximations Prize in 2016 and was shortlisted for the Ryszard Kapuczynski Prize. Saskia Fogel, her first novel, Permission, will be published this month. So there are some notable successes as far as the UK scheme is concerned over the years, and clearly it's a scheme which is now well established and is doing a lot of the right things. In order, though, to allow some time for audience questions, I'd like to perhaps come on to a final question from me for our panelists, which is to do with what happens next, and in what ways, from your perspective, do you think existing mentorship schemes can do more, can do differently, or whether there's still a need for new things to be attempted? Danny?
Yeah. I think with regards to the NCW scheme, which is the one I know best, I think there are a lot of things that work very well. I think we've figured it out over the years, starting with Catherine over there and Sarah running it since its inception, more or less. I think it works extremely well. I think one of the questions now is how to focus it on language choice or genre choice or translator choice, and try and make it as deliberate as possible and as targeted as possible, which is partly a question of funding. It's partly a question of how we get money which allows us to design a scheme which isn't just, as it were, led by the money, if you see what I mean. And what I mean by that, if it's not clear, is there are certain languages which are very well funded. We could just do mentorships in the same 4 languages for the rest of our lives, but actually we want to find ways of using the scheme to diversify what's being published, to diversify the pool of translators, which means thinking about funding models which aren't simply, we love working with the Dutch Foundation for Literature, which is great, and they're great partners and they're great funders, but we can't also only do Dutch forever. And one of the things that I think I'm proudest of are those moments when Sarah and the team have found ways of thinking about the funding model differently, thinking about where the money comes from differently, and the programming differently in such a way that we can use the program to look at those languages which are not in fact being funded necessarily. What Deborah's doing very specifically with the mentorship that Jeremy's doing is thinking we're going to have a mentorship which is as seriously literary and thoughtful and everything as all of the others, but also it can have an effect on who the translation profession is, who the translators are. So I think there are lots of things that we can do to think about the particular imbalances we have in translation, which is to say who the translators are, what we're translating, it's to do with genre, it's to do with gender, it's to do with books for children and adults, it's to do with language very much, it's to do with the power of languages, and see how much we can use this program, the model which we know works very well, to target it to do things that are also quite activist, to do things that are also very, very deliberately changing the particular biases in our publishing landscape and in our translation profession.
I think like for mentorship, translation mentorship program in Indonesia, not just for the Writing Center, but for other organizations as well. I think the way to sort of kind of like what's next or how to improve it, it's pretty simple actually. You just have to sort of kind of cast a wider net for the mentors, and automatically, since the mentors also select the mentees, then you will cast a wider net for the mentees as well. I mean, it's not going to be easy because we still have the white gatekeepers of the Indonesian literature. They're all around London Book Fair at the moment, but you know, there are people that you can, I mean, you know me, and there are people that you can see. There are writers who are younger writers who you can talk to, and you can find out from them. So yeah, I think that's pretty simple actually. Yeah.
Thank you. Julia.
And speaking about a program like ours, the fellowship that was designed between Lithuania and the Lithuanian Culture Institute and the British Council, I definitely think it must continue. And that is going to be the most powerful thing it can do. It was a great thing, they tried it out, and now it needs to grow and not stop, because last year Lithuania was one of the market-focused countries, and it isn't anymore, and probably won't be for a long time. So as opposed to being just this bright star, it should just become this sort of almost like boring, continuous thing, and that's going to be great. And yeah, because the community needs to grow. I know that the community of translators who are trying to work between these two languages, because that's what we do. We work between these two languages and between the two countries and the two cultures. And yes.
I'm sorry, I've been talking too much, but just very quickly to pick up on something Julia said. I think there's also a question of how these things get sustained, not just in terms of more and more people, but actually the same people year on year. Because in fact, it was great to have 4 kind of new entrants, as it were, to the Lithuanian to English literary translation profession last year. But 5 years from now, that would mean there would be 20, and at the moment there isn't enough work. And I think there are a number of things that we have to do to think about, first of all the ways of creating work for all these new translators, but also think about what can then be added to your experience and your knowledge, so that the 4 of you, and I'm working with a Lithuanian translator now, how your experience can be deepened and enriched, rather than just thinking every year we're going to have another 4, another 4, another 4, and then we will end up with, at some point, we'll have 400 Lithuanian translators, and everyone will starve because there isn't enough work for everybody.
I agree. I am up for that. Yes.
So it's the same. We're in fact addressing the person who's looking after this program. So now you have to just have the same 4 mentees every year forever. That's okay, right? She nodded.
But a surplus of Lithuanian translators sounds like a delightful problem to have. I mean, we kind of have the opposite thing happening.
Have too many Lithuanian translators.
A good problem to have. Jeremy, I wonder, from your perspective, thinking about the other schemes that you've been involved in, the American scheme, for example, the ALTA Emerging Translators Program, that runs for a full year, doesn't it?
Yes.
It's set up rather differently. The Singapore scheme that you've been involved in, that has a rather more detailed program of, and more of a steer given to the mentees. I wonder if you could say something about those schemes and in relation to the NCW scheme.
Well, first of all, the American Literary Translators Association, ALTA, mentorship scheme is, in case you weren't aware, open to international applicants and comes with airfare to America, so everyone should definitely consider applying. I think it's not so much about different schemes being better or worse as serving different needs. And this comes back to what a couple of people have said about casting as wide a net as possible and having many different programs that serve different needs and entice people from different backgrounds, different languages, different regions into the profession. Because from the outside, the publishing industry and literary translation in particular is like this big forbidding fortress that when I'm talking to people who are outside the profession who want to get in, it really is this mystical thing that no one can quite understand from the outside. So the greater number of points of entry we can provide, the better, and hope that by having as many of these as possible in as wide a number of forms as possible, as many people as need to will find their way in. If we ever get to a point where we have too many literary translators, then maybe we could cut back. But, I think we're quite far from that. Oh, Danny, you can't do everything.
I would just say that if you translated from the languages I translate from, you would think it is possible to have too many literary translators. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay, we've been talking about casting the net widely, and I'd like to do that now and open up to our audience and ask for any questions and contributions from our audience. I think we have a roving mic, so please, if you could just... yes? So, Nikki Harmon.
Hi, yeah. It's been really interesting listening to you. I just wanted to put in one more point, one more way in which mentorship can be really useful. The first one that I did, actually, the publisher of the book that Anna Homewood was translating, and I was her mentor, was very happy that I was the mentor. I didn't actually have to do very much because Anna is extremely competent. But the relationship between mentorships and the publisher and how the publisher feels about new emerging translators, I think is another thing to add to the equation.
Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned about the fact that the mentors often are the ones who choose the mentee. I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about what kind of criteria you look for when people apply for these sort of schemes, how you decide which languages you want to prioritise, etc.
Who would like to... Danny, do you want to take that?
I think it'll depend on the scheme. I think that the NCW one, that was the BCLT one, the way the languages are determined, there are a number of different factors, which will be partly to do with funding, partly to do with priorities, partly to do with seeing a particular need in the market. I often get asked by publishers, can you recommend a translator from language X? And there are some X's for which there are loads of people I can recommend, and there are some where I can see that there's a gap. In some cases, it's to do with prioritizing a country that might be a market focused at a book fair, whatever. So the language is determined by a number of different things. And then selecting the mentee, again, there are a number of different factors which are partly to do with this person obviously has to be producing good work. The person obviously has to be serious about this. The person has to be at a point in their career where they would benefit from the mentorship, which might be, I've translated no books, it might be, I've translated 5 books. There isn't a particular moment, but for each person there are certain moments when you can really see how they could actually benefit from that relationship. And it has to be someone for whom the particular mentor at that moment thinks they can be useful. because I have on various occasions looked at something, and especially in fact with the escalator scheme where I'm working with a couple of fiction writers, where I've looked at a piece of writing and gone, this person is obviously great, really, really promising, this person will be a brilliant writer. I'm not sure what I could give them to get them from really, really promising to really, really brilliant. And so when you have the conversation with, between the mentor and the organizer of the scheme, or between a group of mentors, partly it's about, I can see what I would helpfully do for this person. I can identify what they particularly need. And I'm glad Nikki mentioned her own experience of being one of our two kind of pilot mentors. Sounds like teaching people to fly planes. Nikki, who is an airplane instructor as well. One thing that was really interesting about that very first experience was that we had these two pilot mentees, and Nikki had somebody who was about to sign her first contract to publish a book with Virago, and Nikki kind of looked over her shoulder and helped her with the contract and with the actual book, and it was very focused on this one thing and this one moment, and this is exactly when Anna needed it. The other mentee was sort of thinking about translation as maybe quite an interesting thing. Didn't have a contract, didn't have a publisher, didn't have a book, didn't have anything, but had a great deal of promise, huge talent. And the mentor was able to do very different things with him. But she absolutely could see what it was that he particularly needed. And so being part of that very, very first conversation where the mentor can say, I know what I would do for this person. I think I can diagnose and help this person. Rather than the mentor just being presented with someone and told, here is someone who we think is quite a good translator in some language, see what you can do.
About languages, I wanted to ask you, what languages do you speak? Oh, a language or... So Spanish and Portuguese, Danny. But about you asked about how to know which ones are relevant, or not relevant, but maybe more important 1 year. And you've probably heard about the University of East Anglia Summer School, and they always publish that beautiful, impressive list of courses they are going to run, and I'm doing some promotion here for free. And so you can check those, and but I think you're lucky with your big languages anyway. So.
Perhaps one final question? Yes.
Hi. I wanted to ask those of you who have been mentors, either in the panel or maybe someone in the audience, if you could tell us a bit more about what you get as a mentor out of a mentorship, because the benefits for the mentee are obvious, I think, but sometimes the benefits for the mentors are not really spoken about. I'm asking partly because I'm running a mentoring program in Spain for the Spanish Translators Association, and it's a fairly different scheme from what you've been describing. But the problem we've had is that we have a lot more people who want to be mentored than people who are happy to volunteer to be mentors, because we can't pay them a fee and they have to do it voluntarily. And I've already pointed out lots of benefits for them, and we have lots of volunteers and it's great, but if I can give them more reasons why it's great to be a mentor, I think it would help some of them to take part in our program.
Antonio, to answer this question.
Jeremy?
Well, because I'm a raging egotist, I actually did answer the question literally in my head when I first saw the topic, and thought mentorship has done loads for me. I mean, being a mentor kind of makes you think about your practice rather than just doing it, because it's one thing to just get into a routine and sort of be a translator in a certain way, but then when you're telling someone else what you do and then looking at their practice, you start to go, well, is this actually the best way to do it? Or you start giving them advice. And I have actually been in the position of giving my mentee advice and catching myself thinking, that's a good idea, I should do that. So I have become more systematic and grown up in my own work as a result. And I would say I learn a lot just by interacting with the mentees. And I learn a lot from them because they know things I don't.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you to all our panelists on this session. Before we wrap up, can I point you in the direction of a couple of sessions that Danny will be chairing tomorrow morning if you are still around. And Jeremy will be in conversation tomorrow afternoon with Chris Gribble from the National Centre for Writing. Do take a copy of the Emerging Literary Translators 2019 brochure if there are copies still available. Do please take flyers for the BCLT Summer School, which has already been mentioned and which is seeking applicants at the moment. And just with my BCLT hat on, can I advertise as well the forthcoming Sebald lecture, which will be held in London in about a month's time on the 17th of April, and it's going to be Emily Wilson talking about her translation of the Odyssey, and there's another flyer for that too at the back. But it's time to wrap up. Thank you all for your attention, and thank you in particular for our 4 speakers. Thank you.